Okay, and we are live. Welcome to the show. Today we've got a very, very special treat for you. It's a conversation which rages online, and there are a million people who have opinions on this. Very few of them are qualified to hold that opinion. So today, hopefully, we can bring a little bit of detail and nuance to the conversation or the debate of, does the Torah forbid a Jewish state? With us on the channel today, we've got two absolute lions. So I've enjoyed watching their debates and conversations for years now. So many of you are familiar with Mordechai Ishemini. He's been on the channel several times before. He's made a name for himself online, promoting Judaism, promoting Maimonidean Judaism, engaging with the enemies of the Jewish people in very fiery debates. And that is, he's got his own channel, which is linked down below, which is Guerilla Judaism. So please go check out his channel on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe. And so he will be arguing for the motion that the Torah doesn't forbid, or against the motion that the Torah forbids a Jewish state. And arguing against him will be Josh. Now, Josh is one of the most knowledgeable Jewish debaters at Speaker's Corner. He's been going there for a couple of years now, maybe a bit longer. And I've seen him take down missionaries who've been researching the Jewish Christian scriptures for decades, and I've watched Josh just wipe the floor with them. So it's an absolute pleasure to watch him engaging non-Jews. I've never seen Josh engage or having internal conversations, so I'm really looking forward to this particular conversation of, does the Torah forbid a Jewish state? And so really I'll open the floor up to you both to it'll be a very, very free-flowing conversation, but maybe Josh, seeing as though we started the conversation at Speaker's Corner, where you were adamant that the Torah forbids it, maybe you can just bring a little an explanation as to why you believe Torah or Judaism, because I'm sure it's external to the Torah as well. If you could give us shed some light on your position, that would be really fantastic.
So my position is quite interesting. In that I don't actually believe that the Torah necessarily forbids a Jewish state or forbids making a state during the exile. Rather, I believe that the Torah has various different legitimate hashkafas, different viewpoints that stem from it. And my main argument is that there are legitimate hashkafas, legitimate positions in Torah that say that a state is permitted, and legitimate positions that say that a state is forbidden. And these are perfectly legitimate Torah positions for a Jew to hold, because there's very big people on both sides. We have the likes of the Besher Chochmah and Rav Kook on the one hand saying that a state is perfectly permitted and even advisable. And we have, on the other hand, great people like the Minchas Elazar and the Divrei Yoel of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who are very much adamant that a state is forbidden and very not advisable. So we have people on both sides, great Talmidei Chachomim, Gedolei Yisrael, who we can definitely say are giving us very much room to maneuver within Judaism, to follow a Rav, to listen to what a Rav has to say, and to follow his guidance in Hashkafa. And that's really my position. I happen to be somebody who leans more to the anti-Zionist position. I am a Yekka. I follow Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch most of the time. I try. And so that's my personal position. But I'm not a big Talmud Chacham. I'm not somebody who's in the ring with these big people. So I'm not going to sit here at any point or stand anywhere and say that this Talmud Chacham is right and this one is wrong, or this one is right and this one is wrong. You're never going to hear that from me. I'm not going to say Rav Hirsch is right and Rav Kook is wrong. That's not going to happen. Instead, I'm going to say they're both right and you're allowed to follow either one. What I'm going to say is definitely wrong it's wrong for a layperson to say that one of the opinions is wrong. So it's wrong when you have lay people from, let's say, Satmar, who say that the Mizrahi position is completely wrong. That's not good. You shouldn't be saying that. And it's completely wrong for people in the Mizrahi camp to be saying that people in Satmar are completely wrong, or to quote a certain person, that Satmar have founded a whole new religion. This is something which is completely antithetical to how we build a framework of a broad tent of Orthodox Torah Judaism, in which we have different hashkafas from different halachic authorities.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so Mordechai, what I'll now move the conversation over to you. I think there's maybe more that you agree on than I would have originally imagined opening the conversation, but it'd be very interesting to get your thoughts on that. You're on mute at the moment.
All right, am I unmuted? Okay, so first of all, it's great to meet you, Josh. I watched 2 or 3 of your debates on the corner, and I was well impressed with how well you handle these various competitors, okay? The way you sholet b'psukim, and the way you handle them psychologically, and you were not too aggressive, and you're very polite. So first of all, yashar koach, chazak u'baruch, yavducha amim, all right? What you've done with the Christians and Muslims, I have not disagreed with. However, what you said today, I'm going to push back on the points that I disagree with, respectfully, of course. And it may not be as head-to-head Zionist versus Naturi Karta as many of you, the viewers, want. However, it's a chance for me, and for you as well, Josh, to maybe discuss fundamental principles of the Torah, that once the fundamentals are understood, then the details are easier to break out on your own. Oftentimes, you have a lot of machlokot, a lot of disagreements and disputes on details that, if you understood the fundamentals, then either there's a real conflict on the fundamentals, or if you understood them, then there'd be agreement. There'd be much agreement. So but just based on what you said now, I'm going to push back on some of your fundamental assumptions, okay? So one of them is, you started off by saying that it's possible in the Torah to have multiple hashkafot that are legitimate, okay? And it's hard to argue with that, because we find in Talmud you have multiple hashkafot that are legitimate. You find in Poskim you have multiple hashkafot. I'm not going to come here and say that my way or the highway and that's it. However, a thing can be true or can be false. In the real life that we live in, electricity on Shabbat is either a melacha or it isn't. You can say both positions are legitimate. You can say that there's a machloket, right? But eventually there has to be hachra'ah, and you can just, a layperson who's not studied can decide to go along with a reputable rabbi, but the rabbi is not in the position of a judge who decides if the halakha is right. A Rav Kook is not an individual who makes a decision if Zionism is against or for the halakha. He's pointing out the chazal. He's interpreting our tradition. Either his interpretation is correct or not, or Rabbi Shamshon Raphael Hirsch's interpretation is and Yomish and other anti-Zionist rabbis, or their interpretation was correct. So it's not. I would disagree that everybody's okay. It's okay for individuals to follow great chachamim, but the truth is, in most issues, something is either right or it's wrong. And either Medinat Yisrael, as we have it today, is part of the redemptive process, and it's something that's not only allowed but probably required, or it's a Merida b'malchut shamayim, and something that should not have happened, and at best should be fought against, or at best should be ignored. One of these two positions is correct. And you've indicated that you find yourself on the side of the non or anti-Zionist. So that means, in real terms, to me, to a simple-minded person like myself, that you have chosen to follow those Chachamim because you're Yekka and with all due respect, that's the Yekkish tradition, even though many Yekkis today kind of ignore that. Okay, so respect to you for being strong in that position. Now, the other thing that I'm going to qualify what you said, where I disagree with you, is that this idea that is very common today among Jewish people, that, and it goes back to what I just said earlier, that rabbis have authority. Like, who are you to disagree with rabbis? No, the Torah is an open book. The idea of a rabbi is not a judge who decides what the law is. He is a lawyer. He's basically a lawyer who tells you what the halakha is. The halakha has been decided by the Sanhedrin, by the Bedin Hagadol, Shubi Yerushalayim, and subsequently by the Chazal, by the Talmud Bavli, Yerushalmi, and so on. So that is what the law is. The rabbis that disagree are the only authority they have is to interpret to us the law of Chazal. They do not have authority to, for example, make a takana or a gzera, which is an enactment or a law that would require everyone. So if all the rabbis, without assembling a Bedin Hagadol, said Zionism was good or Zionism was bad, that would change nothing about the nature of Zionism. Either it's biblically correct or it's not. Right? So that's what I want to say, and I want to encourage those of my students who are watching, and those who will be my students, and those who are considering, viewing my channel and see how I mention fundamental principles, never to fall into the trap of hiding behind big names, hero worship. Torah is required for all of us to learn. We all have access to the law. We approach Chachamim with deepest respect as someone who tells us what Chazal say, not what they say. Their opinions are just suggestions. So that would how I would frame this whole conversation. And I'm assuming that the discussion that you and I would have, Josh, is on the sources themselves. And by sources, I would prefer, if possible, to focus on master sources, Tanakh and Chazal, rather than throwing out names of brand name rabbis who agree or disagree with our positions.
Cool. And what I'll do, I'm going to bow out of this now and leave the two of you to respectfully go at it. So I'm going to remove myself. I'm still listening and observing, but yeah, Josh.
All right, Josh.
I think it's very interesting what you've said, and I'm going to have to respectfully disagree on the idea that there is, as far as I understood what you said, I might be misrepresenting, but as far as I am concerned, you are saying that later hashkafic arguments between Rabbonim that were not already machlokas back in the time of Chazal are not actually going to affect the reality of whether or not something is good or not good, whether it is Torah accepted or Torah not accepted. So when it comes to the new political movement that sprang up in 1897 of Zionism, it is true to say that there were Rabbonim who supported it and there were Rabbonim who did not support it. Now, Rabbonim had reasons to support it and Rabbonim had reasons to not support it. The reasons given by Rabbonim to not support it were a fewfold. One such reason is the famous Gemara that I'm sure we're going to get into soon in Ksubas of the three Shavuos, the three oaths. Right? That's obviously something that's going to come up. Right? That's one of the main issues that they had with it. But it wasn't the only one. There were issues about the fact that those who were leading the Zionist movement, those who were in charge, were a bunch of Kofrim. They were heretics and people who held from Jewry to disdain and utter contempt, the likes of Theodor Herzl and David Ben-Gurion, to name just two. This is not to say that there are not legitimate reasons to interpret Chazal in different ways, which is what other Rabbonim did. That's obviously what we're going to get into. But I do disagree with what you say that there is either it's good or it's not good, and it doesn't matter what the different Rabbonim are saying on it. It depends on whether or not their interpretation is correct. I think that us, or at least myself, as a lay person, need to trust that they have made certain valued judgments in how to interpret Chazal and how to interpret Psukim, and bringing that together, and that informs their psak. But if their psak is based on a legitimate read of Chazal, and a legitimate interpretation of Chazal and of Torah, then who are we to say, actually, no, he was missing this fact, or he was actually mistaken, or he misunderstood this, and I understand better, or this Rav understood it better. So it could be that another Rav understood it better, but do we know? Do we understand all of the judgments that are going through these big people's heads? I think that we need to approach this with great anava, great humility, and we can't imagine ourselves as in the ring, right? You've got boxers in a ring, and there's punches flying everywhere, and you're not
boxing analogies,
and you're not a professional boxer, and you've got no business suddenly coming into the ring and joining forces with another one and punching the other, especially since you're very weak and you don't know even where to begin. It's not your fight to have. It's not our fight to have. This is a fight of, right, when it comes to machlokas about whether or not there's such a concept of aschalta de geola, that's a machlokas that can be had between various rabbonim, right? We know the Vilna Gaon was very much in favor of the idea that there's such a thing as an aschalta de geola, right? We know that there's a machlokas about whether or not the state was motor at all. Does it contravene the 3 oaths or not? That's Meshech Chochmah versus the Minchas Elazar, right? Which is why the Divrei Yoel held what he held, because it was a Talmud of the Minchas Elazar. He didn't come up with that idea himself, the Divrei Yoel, right? As so many people frame him. He got this from his Rebbe because he followed his Masorah, his Rebbe, and that's how I follow these subjects. I follow it very closely in terms of Masorah, and that's the reason I take the position I hold.
Thank you. So I don't want to belabor this issue too much because we're never going to get to Zionism. But since fundamental principles are so strong, I'm just going to put out there where I get my position from. Okay, Joseph may have mentioned earlier that he called me a Maimonidean, which means I try to follow Harambam's view. And if you read Harambam's introduction to the Mishneh Torah, as well as almost anything else that he wrote about the processes of Jewish law, you'll find that there is no such thing as rabbinic authority post the Talmud. Since the Jewish, in other words, we have a pasuk, V'asita chachol asher yorucha. It's a pasuk in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, you shall do as the judges of your day tell you. And you're espousing a view that's very common in Haredi circles, that means that we have to have piety and listen to the Gedolim, to the great people of our generation, and therefore us as lay people don't have the right to judge what these great people said, because who are we to see the bird's eye view that these great Chachamim have? Now, my point to you, Josh, is that if you notice in our history over thousands of years since Chatimat HaTalmud, every time a Gaon or a Chacham wanted to post a halachic responsa, he wouldn't just say mutar or asur, or forbidden or not forbidden, like the Pope, l'havdil ben hatameh v'hatahor. That's not what he would do. He would bring out the Talmudic sources, maybe bring other Rishonim that kind of understood the Talmud the way he did, and they're admitting by their very actions, from the earliest Geonim until Chacham Ovadia Yosef today, it was never about their authority. It was always them going back to Chazal, to the main sources, and they're showing the lay people. They're not telling the lay people forbidden or allowed. They're telling the lay people, they're showing them the process and why, so that any lay person can look at the Ben Ish Chai's teshuvah, and even if he's not a Talmid Chacham, and even if he didn't have smicha, if he can show that the Ben Ish Chai either had the wrong girsah of the Gemara or misunderstood it, God forbid, right? Then he would be able to rule otherwise. In fact, you find, today it's less popular because Chachamim today are considered infallible by Charedim, but you find, like in the Harambam himself, in his many letters, people challenge his position. This is the great Harambam. Everybody claims to follow, and everybody reads, and every Jewish movement claims that Harambam is their inspiration. So when people would write to Maimonides challenges on the halachic positions, he would refute those challenges, or he would agree with them and change the Mishneh Torah and say, you know what, I made a mistake. Because at the end of the day, we're all bound by the decisions of the Bedin HaGadol and not by the magic knowledge of great Gadol. So, and this is something, the reason I'm continuing to go into this is because I respect the Minhat Elazar as a Av Bedin in his village in Eastern Europe. I respect even the Satmar rabbi, as much as we disagree, he was brilliant. I've just been rereading his V'yoel Moshe over Shabbat, and his like style of writing and the way he calls sources is beautiful. But that does not mean that I'm required to bow to his interpretation when I feel, as a layperson, okay, or anybody feels they can show in the Ketuvim or in the Tanakh or in the Talmud that he's wrong. And that's I think that without getting to some sort of agreement on this, our debate can go on forever, because it's going to be circular reasoning, as I've had with my last debates with Haredim. So anyway, and I'll close off by saying that the truth is your attacks on Zionism should start before my defense, because Zionism, the idea that the Jews have a right and maybe even an obligation to retake their land and rebuild the temple and come back to who we once were, that has kind of already happened, and that has become the default position of Am Yisrael, both observant and non-observant. And right now, people the likes of yourself are a minority, definitely in the Jewish world, but even in the Orthodox world, I would argue that you would be more on the extreme side. Like most Aguda people are somewhere in the middle. So maybe the next step should be, you should fearlessly promote your position of why it's forbidden. We can get into the 3 oaths. I'm not going to do apologetics on the 3 oaths before you throw them out, all right? And any other halachic or agadic sources you would have to say why it's wrong. And it would be more useful, instead of saying, well, this is what Shamshon Raphael Hirsch Zal said, say, here is the position based in Chazal. And then we can have a discussion about Chazal itself.
I'm not comfortable with pretending as if I am someone who understands the processes of interpreting Chazal. It's one thing to learn a Gemara, to sit down and make a learning. It's another thing to understand the judgments being made. And in order to make judgments, you need a huge amount of knowledge that I simply don't have. You might have that kind of knowledge. Who knows? You might be a big Talmud Chacham. You might be an expert in how to learn a sugya, how to learn a shakavatari of a Gemara, and how to learn a medrash, and how to learn this. And you have a whole methodology of psak all worked out. And if so, shkoyach, gesundheit hate, and you should have much more hatzlacha in all of your limadim and psakim going forward. Who knows? You may be one of the great poskei hador. But I'm not. Now, I don't think Rabbonim are infallible. And I know that Rabbonim have been choser on certain things, right? One of the great Rabbonim that I look up to was Rav Shimon Schwab. And there was a position that he took about the controversial issue of the missing 168 years, a position that he took, which later on he was choser, right? He saw various things that he hadn't considered before, and he was choser on it. He went back and he said, actually, no, I was too hasty. But a great Gadol like himself, or a great Gadol, right, Lahavdil, right, all the way back to the Rishonim, right, like the Rambam, right, he can be choser on himself. He knows the judgments that went through in his mind when he made the first psak he made, prior to being pointed out as something that he hadn't given as much weight to, or that he hadn't considered, or even that he had no knowledge of previously by his detractors. And therefore, he knew when they were right and when they weren't, when they didn't quite necessarily have his position, in order that he would be able to then be choser on that position. I am not going to sit here, I repeat, I'm not going to sit here and start quoting a Chazal and start interpreting it, because I don't have authority to do that. not because I think that only a Rav has authority, but because I believe that only someone who has proper knowledge has authority. I am a lay person, and I have another, right? I try to have another, at least, right? And I know my limitations. I'm not going to interpret the three oaths. We know that, for example, right, if you want to give me some, if you want me to give some of Yoel's arguments of the three oaths, you've heard them, right? For example, his argument that although the three oaths are presented as agador, right, but we see that there's precedent that there's agador in the Talmud that can actually be a psak, right? We see that there are such examples of this all over the Talmud, right? And that's an argument that Rav Yoel makes. There's other Rabbonim who will say, no, actually, that there's a reason for those various agodos why they should be considered psak, but that this one should not be considered psak. Or maybe it should be, maybe they will say, even this agodo is considered psak, but you've misunderstood, but this is not the correct interpretation of this agodo, of the three oaths. There's a different interpretation, and here's why. And Rav Yoel will say, actually, no, this is why I hold this interpretation, right? It's a very fluid way of having machlokes, and that's one of the lessons of Gemara in general, that you have these judgments going back and forth between Rabbonim, and it takes a lot of effort, a lot of work when you're learning to try and understand. So do I understand the processes that Rav Yoel did when he was making his judgments, or the processes that Rav Kook was doing when he made his judgments? No. I'm not just name dropping. I'm showing you that I genuinely believe that both of these people were very, very big Talmidei Chachamim, and they knew what they were doing, and they weren't making careless mistakes, and they knew how to interpret a Gemara, but they had different methodologies, and that's all I will say on that matter.
So okay, so I guess I'm gonna have to shoot the first volley, because we're I don't like about promote why Zionism, we know it today, is both legitimate and required. Okay, I'm going to make the following statement from Tanakh and from the Gemara that you mentioned, the Talmudic quote of the three oaths. And hopefully what I have to say is going to be new to the listeners. I'm going to bring an angle that you guys, and maybe you, Josh, yourself, maybe haven't heard before. You're welcome to disagree, and then the viewers can decide. So starting from like the earliest biblical times, from Devarim, from Ezra, we find that the Jewish nations the Jewish nations claim to Eretz Yisrael after Kibush Haaretz, after the first conquest of the land from when we left Egypt after the Exodus, was never required prophetic intervention or miraculous signs from God. So if you look at the beginning of the book of Ezra, you find that Cyrus is inspired, and we even have the Cyrus tablet where you could like match it up. And where Cyrus was inspired, and he thought it would be a good idea to give the Jewish nation, the Hebrews, the Israel, by that time we were already Judeans, the right to go back to Eretz Yisrael. Ezra didn't have to become a prophet or to access any nevuah to get it. He just gathers people, raises funds, raises arms, and takes back Eretz Yisrael to the extent he could. Furthermore, you find that Rambam, for example, mentions Bar Kokhba, Shimon of Kuziba, who recently a lot of archaeological evidence of his views and what kind of person he was has come out. He didn't say that Shimon Nasi Yisrael, Bar Kuziba, that this man is Messiah because there was some sort of prophecy or because there was some sort of magic act that he did. All Shimon Nasi Yisrael did, all commonly known as Bar Kokhba did, was come to the Chachamim and to the nation with a military plan that seemed that he can defeat Rome. And that was all he needed for the Chachamim to say, oh, if you do that, maybe you'll be the Messiah. And if you succeed, you're going to be the Messiah. So it appears from Chazal that the Messianic, and from the Talmud and from Harambam itself, I'm going to get back to the three oaths as well. It appears that the Messianic process is a natural one, and Melech HaMashiach that we speak about all the time is merely a title that retroactively will be given to the person who fulfills those prophecies. So theoretically, if Naftali Bennett tomorrow decides to repent, I mean, he's observant, but he decides to be a Racham, and he comes and he says, listen, we need to repent, we need to go back, Chadesh Yomenu Kekedem, and he decides to build Bet HaMikdash, and he does the things, the checklist of things that are brought down in the Gemara and quoted easily in the Mishneh Torah, in this last chapter of the book of Mishneh Torah, the Yad HaChazakah. He would never have to say he's a Messiah, but he would get that title. And if Netanyahu did it, he would have that title. And if Benny Gantz does it, it's just a thing that you do. And if you did, and that's why you'll find that even, and it's so fluid in the Tanakh itself, that even Koresh, the prophet Yechezkel, I believe, calls Koresh Mishichi. Anyone who contributes to the return of Am Yisrael to Eretz Yisrael, and to the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, has a spark of Messianism in him already, or her even. Okay, will he be the title that we'll give? No, we're going to look for someone who's from Zerah Bet David to give him that title. But it appears that that seems to be the direction of the Tanakh and Chazal. Moreover, the much discussed three oaths, and I'm glad that I have this opportunity. Josh, thank you, and Joseph to allow me to expound on it. I was going to do a separate show on the three oaths on my channel, which I'm going to do as well. But now is a good time to discuss it. So there's a Talmudic quote in Ketubot Kuf Yud, I believe, where there's a discussion. Early Amoraedic Chachamim, meaning rabbis in Bavel, were having a bit of a conflict if it's okay to go back to Eretz Yisrael, or do they have to stay in Bavel, in the Talmudic academies of Bavel. And the Chachamim that were against going back to Bavel, they made it into they claimed that it's prohibited. And the prohibition that they brought is typical Talmudic style. Right now, I know you say, who are we to understand the Talmud? But I'm sure, Josh, that if you and I studied Gemara together, we did a chavruta, we'd have a great time. And I'm sure that you really understand the processes of the Gemara. From the way you speak, I can see you're a Talmudist, and your humility is not, I'm not buying, I know that you're humble, but I'm not buying the thing that you don't know Gemara, and who are we to decide? No, you could definitely understand the Gemara. And let's discuss this Gemara itself. I have a mini chavruta right here. Right, and the way I understand these kind of agadot in general, so I'm just going to review the Agadah. The Agadah says that there's a verse in Shir HaShirim. Now, for those of you who've read the Song of Songs, it's a little bit cringe if you're a yeshiva guy like myself or Josh. It's so cringe, in fact, that even the Gemara says maybe the Chachamim who were canonizing the Tanakh kind of thought maybe we should not include the Song of Songs in the Tanakh. It's a little too erotic to be a holy book. There's a lot of romantic, it's basically a love poem between two very young people. You can see from how it's written. There's a lot of heavy symbolism in it, but it was a bit questionable why it should be canonized. And the Chachamim never explained to us why it should be canonized. It's still a bit of a mystery, I mean. Why? But it's part of the Tanakh, and it's Kodesh Kodeshim, right? And we're going to treat it as it's sacred, right? Now, one of the parts of the Shir HaShirim is a verse where the male lover tells, the female lover, the female character, and it's unclear who she is in real life, if she exists or it's just a parable, unclear. We're not going to get into Shir HaShirim exegesis here, but she says, Hishbati etchem benot Yerushalayim, I've sworn you to an oath, daughters of Jerusalem, al ta'iru ve'al ta'oreru al ta'ava chetechpatz, right? Meaning, do not arouse the love too much, okay? I shouldn't go too far, okay? And it's one of those things, we read it in Beit Knesset on Friday night before Shabbat, unclear what it means. As you grow in Limud Torah, you begin to understand it more. Chachamim typically, and here let's talk a little bit about Babylonian culture, okay? Babylonian Jewish culture. Chachamim, when they wanted to make a political statement, they wouldn't just say, we Chachamim, here's an official political statement, we think you should do X because we're rabbis. They would always couch it poetically in some pasuk or another from the Torah. We call it asmachta. In other words, we use a pasuk in the Torah which definitely doesn't mean what we say it means, but it's a way of reading that pasuk, and that's how we talk politics, that's how we talk about love, that's how we talk about law. Everything is through verses of the Torah because we love the Torah so much. By the way, this still exists to an extent in Sephardic culture, right? If your grandfather is telling you, like, yelling at you about something, he'll say, like, he tells you you're driving and texting, your grandfather will say, shomer p'ta'im Adonai, like, you're fools, God saves you, right? So it's a way of how Chachamim talk about things. So the thesis I am going to put forth about the 3 O's is as follows, very simple. At the time of the early Amoraim, there was still a lot of seeds of rebellion. It was not long after the Bar Kokhba rebellion. There were Jews who still thought that they can fight and defeat Rome. There were Chachamim that kind of were convinced. Okay, many Chachamim were pacifists, and from the Talmud we see those voices are amplified, but we see also some of them had militant leanings, kind of like a right-wing, left-wing argument. And they felt that fighting Rome is something that we should not do because we're going to get wiped out. And the way they expressed that is through using a pasuk in Shir HaShirim, a beautiful pasuk that everyone is familiar with. And they would say, listen, God doesn't want you to push the redemption too much, okay? It's going to happen at the right time. If you push a relationship too much, it's going to blow up. It's not the right time to do it. It's a very human way of saying, let's not rebel against Rome right now. And the Gemara continues to say, because if we do that, right, your blood will be spilled like the deer of the plain, like which gets slaughtered, by hunters. So they're basically hinting a very dark side to this, saying if we're going to continue to be obsessed with redeeming ourselves at a time when the Roman Empire is still so powerful, we're going to end up getting wiped out completely. And therefore, the Chachamim were promoting a more pacifist approach. They said, let's just stay in Bavel. Let's not try to all gather in Eretz Yisrael and fight Rome. And even in the time of Rabbi Akiva and the Tanaitic times when they were fighting Rome, there were Chachamim that felt that way, and they ended up being right. My point in all of this is that this was never seen by Chachamim as a psak halacha that's binding, but as a way of expressing a legitimate political position. And you see this even Harambam, for example, Mishneh Torah, who I try as best I can to follow. He never mentions it in his halachic works. He never says there's a prohibition to do so. On the contrary, he says, we have a conquest, conquering the land is a law, etc. But what he does say is in his epistle to the Yemenite community, to the Yemen Jews. Yemen Jews there was some crazy messianic figure who thought that we can defeat the Arabs and take back Eretz Yisrael and is going to bring miracles, and a lot of superstitious people followed him. So Rambam is gentle. He understands that the people in the Yemen community at the time were very desperate for salvation. And sometimes when you're in a very bad situation, you want to believe superstitious things. So he uses the same pasuk in Shir HaShirim, and he tells them, listen, we're not going to ole b'choma, we're not going to try to conquer it, but it never reached the status of halacha. And I'm also going to say that maybe I'm not an Ashkenaz rabbi, I don't follow any of these, Gaon of Vilna or of Kook. With all due respect, I read them, but I don't consider myself a follower of their way. But even of like the Satmar rabbi and others, the way I choose to charitably interpret their position is not a halachic position that is forbidden, it's asur, but it's more of a fear that this will bring genocide upon us. And ultimately, they're Jewish nationalists, just like you and I are. They want us to have Beit HaMikdash, they want Am Yisrael to return. But at the time, it wasn't clear that we'll succeed. It was possible that we'll get genocided. It was a bet to be made. And there was room for Chachamim to use Torah language to basically express the same issues that they would have with armed revolution and retaking of Eretz Yisrael. I'm going to finish off by saying that the following, and then I'll hand it back to you, Josh. I think that we should take, the reason I think now there's no real room for compromise anymore is because the die has been cast. 3 or 4 wars have been fought. And if you see something in a tree, and if you don't know if it's a cat or a bird, we can argue about it all day. But once it starts flying, we know it's a bird. Okay, there's no use now going back. We can still respect the anti-Zionist rabbis of the past as expressing a legitimate position for the Jewish nation at its time, and understand that once we've defeated our enemies, returned to our land. Eretz Yisrael is the biggest center of Torah in the world, with all of its issues, right? To go now and say this is not the redemption that the prophets clearly say it is, and that there's some sort of prohibition of Aliyah Choma, that to me is like looking at a flying creature and still insisting that it's a flying cat, and not that it's a bird, as the bird people said it was before. That's my take on this.
So the point I'm going to look at is the last point you were talking about just now, about what is this, right? The die has been cast. Has the die been cast? That's what I'm going to that's what I'm going to ask. Has the die really been cast? What does it mean the die has cast? I.e., what it seems to me that you're saying is that Zionism was a possibility, that the Rabbonim at the time was saying, maybe this is going to work, and some Rabbonim can say, no, this is not going to work, and some will say, it doesn't matter if it's going to work, let's try it anyway, right? And that's really all they were saying. And that it's like this thing in the tree, and then once it comes out and it's flying, you know it's a bird. I don't think that's a correct mashal. I don't think that's a correct mashal. The correct mashal, I think, is, look over there. There's somebody who's doing something. Is what that person is doing, is that something which is against the Torah, or is it not against the Torah? Right? Is that person doing a big mitzvah? Right? Like the Kalisha thought he was doing. He said he was doing a big mitzvah. What he was doing, or is what he's doing no small sin, in the words of Hirsch? Right? Is there such a is it now? If it's successful, right? Does that mean that the Aveira suddenly goes away, or does that mean that Aveira has been done and maybe something good will come out of it? Well, that's also a position, right? There were members of the Aguda, right? You alluded to this earlier. Aguda, I see as like the more centrist position between the religious Zionists and the religious anti-Zionists. The Rabbonim of the Aguda, on the whole, did not say it was Osa. There were a few on the fringes of the Aguda who held that making the state was Osa, but on the whole, they were generally of the opinion it was Mutter. The question for them was more a pragmatic thing, and that I think is more to do with what you're saying. Has the die been cast or not? Because when it came to the Aguda, they did see this as an issue of pragmatism. They didn't see this as an issue of being over an Aveira, as being as going against Chazal, right? Breaking some sort of Shavua, whatever exactly is the Shavua. Is the Gemara just making a political point, or is it genuinely making some sort of asmachta based on some sort of Masorah or Ruach HaKodesh or something like that, right? And that's a different debate to be had. But the Aguda were genuinely saying, no, this is it was mutter to begin with, and it's mutter now. But the question now is pragmatism. Is it going to work or not? Some said, no, it's not going to work, right? Don't put your eggs in that basket. Some said, yeah, it might work. Let's give it a go, right? And that's, of course, why Aguda were quite hesitant in 1947, 1948 to join in until they got the status quo agreement, right? As we know, right? They were quite hesitant. For them, it was always about pragmatism. They didn't buy the idea that this was suddenly going to become the beginning of the Geula, because they didn't believe that. They didn't believe in the concept that that physical actions that we do besides keeping mitzvahs and doing Torah could bring the redemption. They didn't think that Aschalta de Geula was a real thing, right? There were other Rabbonim who disagreed, and that's what we call the religious Zionist movement. They believed, actually, yes, we can do physical things, and that will cause the Geula, right? We can actually go and settle the land, like Rav Kalisha said to do, and we can establish a state, as Rav Kook said to do, and by doing these things, even if it's done by people who are very much against the Torah, right? I cite Rav Kook. Then this could still come and bring a big Geula, right? I know there's some people who think Theodor Herzl might have been Moshe ben Yosef, And whether or not that's a legitimate position, I don't know, because I don't know if any great Talmudic Chachamim ever said that, but maybe there were. But the point is that there were big Talmudic Chachamim who did hold what you're saying now of a pragmatic position. They held it was mutter, but let's see, is it going to work or not, right? It's all about pragmatism. But I will definitely disagree with you. There were certainly positions that held, no, this is an issue of either breaking a shavua or doing a big mitzvah, right? Is this a big mitzvah or no small sin, right? That is very much part of it, and we can't discount that.
Okay, so Josh, we are here in this debate, right? You have a position, okay? Either you're going to take that position, right, and say, I think that it's the breaking of a shavua, and it's a sin that's ongoing. Like, is that your position? Is that what you think? Or are you unsure?
My position is that I follow a Rav, and that Rav holds that it's breaking a shavua. So
you are the position, you belong to a team, you're saying, of people who believe that it's breaking a shavua. Now,
yes.
Okay, so let me ask you this. On a personal level, right? And with all due respect, I mean, I had a Hirschian phase when I was young, and it was great. And I love praying with Yekas. There's a sense of authenticity in Yekas tefillah and how they cling to their traditions in a stubborn and beautiful way. I have all due respect to that whole world that you come from, and I don't want you to take this the wrong way. But don't you think that a rabbi who thought that Jews should be German nationalists after World War I, and that Zionism is a sin because, you know, we're really Germans and we have to remain German nationalists until Mashiach comes, don't you think that how history has played itself out sort of proved that with all of the greatness of Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, and with all of his intelligence and derech eretz and Torah and derech eretz and all that, that position has been proven wrong by the mitziyut, by reality? Like, I'm saying this, I respect the fact that you're still clinging to every aspect of Yekesha Hashkafa, of Yekesha Idiyat. It's like going to a museum for me. I'm enjoying this. But on a personal level, do you ever stop and think, this was a bad idea? Maybe the Dvinsk people, the Mizrahi people, whatever you want to call them, that thought that the Jews are a separate nation who will never really be Germans. We should not be celebrating German Independence Day, whatever it was at the time, because the Germans will never accept us as one of them. Maybe they were right.
I think that's a huge misinterpretation of Hirsch. I think that's a huge misinterpretation. He held German culture at the time in very high esteem. Now, that German culture no longer exists, right? So we can't say that he was necessarily proven wrong, right? German culture very much deteriorated. The way that German culture was in his day was very much something that he saw as something that could definitely be used to further Torah observance. And that there's a specific thing in that. But I don't think he was proven wrong, no. I certainly don't think so, because and he certainly was against nationalism. He never suggested that we should be German nationalists. Absolutely not, right? He saw us as having a unique Jewish identity based on our constitution, which is the Torah, and not based on nationalism at all. In fact, Pumfakert, Hirsch held that nationalism in all its forms is like a quasi avodah zarah, because you put the nation above everything else, which is one of the objections that Rav Hirsch and his Talmidim had towards the Zionist movement. Although, of course, Rav Hirsch was nifter shortly before the Zionist movement was founded. No, I don't believe that he was proven wrong. No.
Okay, now it's been a while since I've studied Rav Hirsch, so I'm maybe a bit rusty on this, but wasn't there like this German national holiday that Rav Hirsch celebrated, like the foundation of the German state? Wasn't he promoting Jews being just taking German citizenship seriously, serving in the military even at some point. Was that not part of Hirsch's? I may be wrong about this. I'm asking you. You would know more than me about this before I start looking this up.
I've not heard that before. It might be the case. I'm not a Bucky. I've not heard that before though, and I have heard a lot about Hirsch.
Okay, all right. So you're arguing that that Rav Hirsch was not for Jews being part of the German state, being part of the German
that they shouldn't be German nationalists, but that they should actively partake in the German state. There's a difference. Okay,
so I have not done enough homework to prepare quotes to defeat this notion. So I'm going to have to let that go, to be honest. But I'm going to just say that even if you're going to argue that he wasn't pro-German nationalism, okay, but for just Jews being loyal citizens to Germany and waiting till we're redeemed, okay, that would be, let's say, a minimalist approach to Hirschian philosophy. And in general, it's nice to have someone publicly propose Yakischkeit, original German Jewry, because it's a dying breed. So I'm not looking to really fight it too hard, because it is something that I value for its just for its beauty and its uniqueness and authenticity. But I'm going to ask you this: hasn't history proven that the Jewish, especially German Jews, who were so deeply enmeshed, deeply involved in German culture and German society? So as a Yekka, wouldn't it be, and many Yekkas have this opinion as well, you're one of the few Mohegans that trying to be Yekkish at everything. Wouldn't it be a little bit too stubborn to reject the notion that the Zionists were telling Rav Hirsch when he rejected them, but both religious and non-religious, that this German experiment could only end badly, and blood and tears will be the what's going to happen in Europe? And Zionism, from a perspective, I know this is not a halachic question, but it is a historic one. And according to your view of halakha, you think that rabbis do have, great rabbis, I disagree with that, but you seem to think that great rabbis do have some sort of effect on what the halakha actually is, all right? How we're supposed to see it. How would you deal with the fact that German Jewry, which was the most integrated, collapsed so hard? And from Germany, the hatred of Jews wiped out Jews all over Europe. Isn't that in itself proof that the Jews are a separate nation that need to be in their own state? V'yafa sha'achat kodem, the sooner the better. And that the Jews that were pushing for emergency evacuation to Eretz Yisrael, who, like Rav Kook, for example, and others, were proven right by history.
No, I don't think that. And the reason I don't think that is because Rav Hirsch was relying on the premise that this German culture would continue to go up, right? That German culture that was in those days would continue. Now it turns out that unfortunately that did not end up happening. Now he didn't prophesy. He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a Novi. He didn't prophesy this is definitely going to be this German culture is going to continue all the way till the times of Mashiach. He certainly hoped that would be the case, and on that, unfortunately, that hope it ended in failure. But the idea that type of culture that the Germans had in those days, in his day, could be something that that Jews could immerse themselves in as a supplement, as an important supplement to Torah observance, and as a way of connecting to the beauty of Torah and of what Hashem has given us on this earth, in all the asceticism, I can never pronounce that word, and all these cultural ideas of how beautiful and valuable these would be to living a fruitful Torah life. I think that he was absolutely right about that, And the fact that the Germans went down so much, and they degraded their culture so terribly in a way that destroyed European Jewry, is something that is a great tragedy, but it doesn't prove wrong the actual thesis of Rav Hirsch.
How does it not prove wrong the thesis that through German culture we can glorify Torah when the Germans destroyed the Jewish nation and brought upon us the biggest catastrophe we've ever had?
Because when they did that, they abandoned what German culture was. They took on a mad nationalism, right? I said before, Rav Hirsch was very much against nationalism. They took on a nationalism that was even more radical than nationalisms that Rav Hirsch had seen in his day. This was a nationalism unprecedented to any sort of scale. And this was a nationalism that caused the deaths of tens of millions of people. That was not the culture that Rav Hirsch was talking about at all.
Obviously, that's not the culture. I'm not claiming that Rav Hirsch was a supporter of Nazism, God forbid. That's definitely not the argument I'm making. But what I'm saying is that he made a bet, okay? He basically wagered that the Jewish civilization, I don't want to disagree with you on Hirschian philosophy too much, because I'll have to defer to you that you know more about that, but I would think that he was a loyal Talmid Chacham who loved the Torah, grew up in Germany, and he used, the way Harambam in his letter to Lunel says, I use Aristotelian philosophy and Arabic culture to show how great the Torah is, but not that the Torah needs it. It's right. You remember the letter I'm referring to, right? It's like it's a tool I use to explain the beauty of the Torah, right? I don't have to quote it in Hebrew, but which is anyway in Arabic. But actually, no, it wasn't Hebrew. But I'm stopping. The point is that I would say Rav Hirsch was just trying to beautify, like make the Torah more popular in Germany, which he did. But in doing that, he bet on German Jewry being a success. And the fact that German Jewry ended the way it did, yes, of course, we're going to blame the Nazis and so on, but can't you admit that Jabotinsky or Rav Kook or all those Jews that were saying, no, Europe, our time in Europe is up. We need to leave before it ends in catastrophe. Why is it hard for you and others like you to admit that they were right about that? You can still be yeke about everything else, but here's one point that the Zionists were right about.
Were they right that it would end in disaster? Sure, they were right that it would end in disaster. But I don't believe it was clear at the time that would be the case.
Yeah, it wasn't clear. It was a prediction. It was a prediction that, look, people were reading the map. Herzl himself, okay, with all of his faults, he didn't need all of the Zionism, right? He was already assimilated. His kids were assimilated. He didn't need it, but he looks at the geopolitical status of Europe from his, elite place in Austro-Hungarian Empire. He's like, no, these guys are going to get wiped out. He writes this in his diaries. Jabotinsky says that. Other Zionist leaders, not all, but others did say that. Some religious, some not. They made a prediction based on their reading of reality. The anti-Zionists, whether it's Bund and their secular side, or it's Rav Hirsch and the Hasidim and their religious side, those Hasidim that were against Zionism, they bet on the wrong horse. All we're asking is for you guys to admit it, and not because we want to be told, all right, some of us may be descended from anti-Zionists ourselves, but we belong to an ideological group that says, well, this galut entity was a bad idea then. It's still a bad idea. It's time for Am Yisrael to go back to being a nation.
That the Golos idea was a bad idea. No, the Golos idea is not an idea of good or bad. It's an idea of whether or not you believe it's a reality. Yes, those who believe there's such a thing as Chalz to Geula, we can end the Golos ourselves, right? So we can actually take away the reality. Of Hirsch's idea that there is such a reality of Golos, and that, by the way, according to him, would even exist in Eretz Yisrael, is something that's not suddenly going to change, right? Even with the destruction of European Jewry, right? Golos is still a thing, and it's a spiritual and a physical reality. Right, no matter where you are in the world.
Yeah, because we're refusing to build a temple. We're obviously mentally in galut, right? But I agree that we're in galut mentally, right? But as far as reality is concerned, we have redeemed ourselves. The nation is picking up arms, has taken back its land, has asserted its independence. You can say that we are in exile. We are not. But you can say we're in a mental exile.
Believe that's Chalta Geula is a real thing. Yes.
Okay, forget it. Even if let's not use the catchphrase of Chalta Geula. Let's look at Mishneh Torah's description of Yemot HaMashiach. The Gemara's description of Yemot HaMashiach, the Mishneh Torah uses, En ben Yemot HaMashiach liyamenu anu, ela sha'abud malchuyot. The only difference between the time of the Messiah and today is Jewish independence. That's the difference. Yet we're supposed to build a temple. It's a commandment, but we're being cowards. We're not doing it. It's a separate point. But the reality is we are not in that exile anymore. We're out. Why would you want to reinterpret or redefine that very obvious reality?
It's not a reinterpretation of redefining of the reality. Yes, it's true that Jews today do have political independence, and yes, it's true. The Gemara does say, as you rightly quoted, that Shibud Malchius is really the main difference, or in fact the only difference. It depends on the interpretation. But regardless, Golus, in a spiritual sense, we know existed even when Jews had political independence in their land. Right? When we know that there was such a thing as Golus Yovon, and Golus Yovon, Jews
they subjugated us. They took over the Bet HaMikdash and put a statue of Zeus in the Bet HaMikdash. There was naked, there was gay pride parades in Jerusalem every day, right? Of course we were in Galut then, but we had no independence, neither spiritually nor physically. We were not yet until the Maccabees managed to defeat them.
So
we're not in that.
So do you believe that when the Maccabees were in charge, when we had the Hasmonean dynasty, that we were not in Golus at the time?
It's a little complicated because there wasn't a clear victory where we didn't pay any tribute and the Greeks went away. We ended up having to pay tribute to Rome. It was a very unclear situation. But if we're going to say that we were completely independent and we built the Bet HaMikdash and the Hasmoneans were independent kings, I would say that the Galut was over, if that's what happened. If historically you get into the details of it and you see that we managed to get a little bit of autonomy, but not real independence, then I'm not so sure about that. But it's nowhere near the position we're in today.
Right.
But what I would ask you is this. I would say, let me ask you a question. Okay, so we disagree about the Shavuot, and you keep mentioning boxing both in your other debates, and you mentioned it here. I don't know if you've boxed before, but if you did, you'd be very good at bobbing and weaving. And because it's hard to pin you down on something to argue about, because you kind of get along, and I do like you personally. I'm not trying to be mean, but I'm trying to advocate for a case. Let me ask you this: in today's world, right, Hayom Hazeh, right, the way we live today, is there any practical application to your anti-Zionist theology, or does that mean just a regular Aguda guy who has edgy views about Israel?
So unless you're in the fringes of religious anti-Zionism, who say that you shouldn't even become a citizen of the state of Israel, or maybe you shouldn't even live in the state of Israel, unless you're in the fringes, and I'm not in the fringes of that movement, it really is just in the ideas. It's not. It doesn't really have a nafka in it.
So then I'm going to ask you another question. Okay, you're on this channel, which is a Zionist channel. I've seen you publicly debate Muslims and very masterfully, by the way. You destroyed, I wouldn't say you destroyed them. It's not the right way of saying it, but you really made your case very effectively, both against Christians and Muslims. Here you are now with us. My question to you is: do you notice that in the actual world we live in, not in the world of ideas of what happened in the past, in the world today in 2021, the Minyanam, those that hate us and that would they want to wipe out Israel, and so on, that they gain enormous strength from anti-Zionist religious arguments, and every anti-Zionist religious argument that's made gets amplified 1,000 times, and they use that to gaslight actual Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, fighting to survive, right? They use that as a weapon against us. So besides for loyalty to this anachronistic Hirschian ideology, okay, what would drive you to promote an anti-Zionist view from a religious perspective?
So when it comes to the first point you made there, which is that this is kind of adding fire to the flames of the non-Jewish anti-Zionists, right? It's quite obvious that they were always going to find an excuse, and if it's not going to be the few Hirschians that exist today, it's going to be people who I consider to be outside of the realms. There are very few groups that I consider to be that are nominally, or at least claim to be Torah observant, that I claim to be completely chutz lamachane, completely outside of Torah Judaism. One of those groups is Neturei Karta. And Neturei Karta are going to carry on doing what they're doing, and they're going to keep on meeting with the haters of Yisrael, the people who want to see us all dead, and who claim that that things like the Holocaust never happened, right? They're going to carry on doing that, and those are the people that the non-Jewish anti-Zionists are going to continue to latch onto. I can assure you, they're not latching onto the few Hirschians that exist. They're not even latching onto Satmar. They're always latching onto Neturei Karta. Satmar don't associate themselves with these people, right? Tolos Aaron don't. No one besides Neturei Karta is holding the Palestinian flag. We don't do that. It's not a Jewish thing. It's not a Torah thing to do, to openly support those who want to see us all dead. This is a Neturei Karta phenomenon. It's a fringe movement, and it's outside of Torah Judaism.
So not to be mean, but okay. I'm going to just disagree with a few small points. Satmar is not Neturei Karta; they're a notch lower, but Satmar does anti-Israel demonstrations. They get aired on CNN, they get aired on international news, and they have these big asifot, these big events where you basically call for the end of Israel in their own way without waving the Palestinian flag. Granted. Now, that in itself is already not a small propaganda victory for those that hate us. And I know that you're not a huge name in the Jewish world of advocacy and so on. However, you have the talent to be. In the sense that I'm not flattering you, I'm legitimately saying you have a lot of chokhmah, you're good with people, you know how to make an argument, and therefore, but you, and in this debate, you haven't been rabidly anti-Israel. That's not my point. But my point is that anything that you say or do in your position as an advocate for Torah, which is really an advocate for Israel too, but advocate for Torah, anything that you say or do that can be perceived or used as a weapon against our existence, our physical existence in Eretz Yisrael and probably the world over, will be used. And therefore, that's the point I'll make to you. And you're young and you're starting off and you're doing good work, and I'm sure you'll continue to do good work. So I just want you to take that into account, and I'm saying this here at a public forum. I think that we're running out of time, and I don't want to end on this note. Maybe if you'd like to indulge me and the viewers, and I know this is not necessarily Zionism per se, but I know that Hirschianism or Hirschian views, there's a lot of profundity there. I'm going to assume that 95% of people watching this don't know anything about either of Hirscher's ideas. Maybe you want to take something, whether Zionist related or not Zionist related, and teach us a little bit Torah, maybe about Eretz Yisrael or about the parasha or anything, so that we all gain something from that as well.
Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch is, as I'm sure you're clearly aware by now, is very close to my heart. And he had a huge milchama, a huge war to fight against the Reform movement, and he saved German Jewry from the spiritual holocaust that the Reform movement were driving at the time, and there's some very, very powerful things. Just one thing I'll bring out from there's a haftorah that I particularly there's a perush that he wrote on on the Siddur that is connected to some things that have been said today. So I'll just read it out for you because it's something very very interesting. He writes this on the Siddur, so you might find this interesting. He says, when during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, the uprising led by Bar Kokhba proved a disastrous error, it became essential that the Jewish people be reminded at all times of another important fact, namely, that Yisrael must never again attempt to restore its national independence by its own power. It was to entrust its future as a nation solely to Hashgacha Protis. Therefore, when the nation, crushed by this new blow, had recovered its breath and hailed even the permission to give a decent burial to the hundreds of thousands who had fallen about Beitar as the dawn of a better day, the Chachomim who met at Yavna added yet another bracha to the tefillah of the restoration of Yerushalayim. And this fourth bracha, which we say in Birchas Hamazon, is an acknowledgement that has always been Hashem and Hashem alone, who has given us and still gives us to this very day the good in which we have had cause to rejoice, who hativ, who mativ, who yativ lanu, and that for future good too we may look to none other but Hashem and none besides him. That's the thought I'll leave you with.
Amazing, guys. Really, really appreciate it. Fascinating debate from both of you. The comments were really interesting, reading people's thoughts as you both advance your ideas. So yeah, really appreciate the debate. Learned a lot from both of you. So thank you both for coming on the show. Can you shout out your social medias so people know where to find you? If something that you said resonated, so that you can go and find more about your philosophy or about your views on the outside of just Zionism, but Judaism in general. Where can they find you both?
How about you start? I did most of the talking.
I mean, I have a YouTube channel. It's called Jews at the Corner. Please subscribe. Please have a look. There's a lot of we're a new channel, started about 7 months ago. The first Jewish Speakers Corner channel, unless you count this one.
Cheers, Josh.
Yeah. So have a look. I'm sure you'll find some of it quite interesting. You can always reach out to me in the comments, and I'll try to respond. Thanks for the opportunity to speak about this topic.
Hopefully we get you a few more followers as well, because you really do deserve them. The way you engage with Christian and Muslim apologetics, particularly when they're putting Judaism in the spotlight, I think is really commendable, and you deserve a lot of followers for the work that you do. So please, if you're not already following Jews at the Corner, head over to YouTube, follow them now. It's worth a subscription. You will not regret it, I promise you. Mordechai, where can they find you?
So first of all, I'm going to subscribe as well. I have several channels, but the only one I really care about is the one called Guerilla Judaism. And the reason I care about it, I just started a few weeks ago from an earlier podcast called Fastad Podcast. The purpose of my channel is basically to showcase the views of how Maimonides, the great Harambam, how he saw the world, how he understood Judaism, and to help guide those of you who are already my students and those of you who are interested in the subject to see Harambam's perspective, whether it's the holidays, whether it's Parashat Shavua, right, and halachic principles in general. So as you've noticed, we started this debate. I went straight to fundamental principles. Harambam has this philosophy, and I'm a follower of his in this matter, that once all of us lay people understand fundamental principles in philosophy and which we call shkafa, as well as in halacha, we can be independent Jews. We can study the halacha and know pretty much what to do. When we go to chachamim and rabbis and ask them questions, there'll be more of guides showing us what the law is, as opposed to people decision makers who decide for us, and our relationship with the Torah, and hence our relationship with God, will be much more alive, much more meaningful, much more deeper, and much more real. So I urge you to follow that channel. And if you have any suggestions or subjects you want me to address, you can comment in that group or send me. How do you contact me? On the channel, in the comments would be enough. Okay, my other political stuff is probably going to die down because as I'm getting more into Torah, I'm interested less in politics. So that's that. Thanks.
Perfect, thank you. And let us know who you thought won the debate. If it was a debate, in the comments below. Shout out your man. I'm sure they both appreciate that. And if you'd like to support the Israel advocacy movement, make sure that you're following us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. All of the links are on the right. And if you want to support us, you can either purchase our merch or donate via Patreon. It all helps. So yeah, thanks a lot, guys. Josh, Mordechai, really enjoyed it. Thanks for coming on the channel.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.